there, but for the grace of God go I. So what did he mean by that? Let's try to interpret that. He was saying, if without God's help, I could have ended up in the same situation as those people. And John Harsanyi, and then you probably associate this with John Rawls, if you guys have read Rawls, but it's really from well before John Rawls's work, gave a strong argument along the lines of what Bradford says. And they basically tried to maintain a libertarian, choice-based sort of freedom type approach, while at the same time arguing that there should be redistribution. And can anyone summarize the Harsanyi argument? Yeah, go ahead, Connor.
So you basically said, assume that you don't know what rank income you'll have in society.
Yeah.
And try to maximize the expected utility you'll have. So it just turns out to trying to maximize the average utility.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So the idea is, we know that people buy insurance against all sorts of risks they face in life, right? Against health, against, cars, because it's more valuable to have money in a terrible situation than it is to have, more money in a situation where you're doing well, right? We would therefore think, I can buy insurance against health outcomes, but usually I only buy it for anything that happens this year. So a lot of people wish they could have long-term insurance, like we talked about before, right? Once you're already sick and then they start charging you more, you've already defeated the point of insurance. So people would like to have long-term health insurance. But then also, once you're already the age 20 when you can buy insurance for yourself, a lot of stuff's already happened to you that's going to determine how well you do for the rest of your life. So if you could go back to the age 15 and buy insurance against what college you get into, buy insurance, et cetera, you'd probably want to do that, right? And I bet most people would do that if there was access to insurance like that. But then if you go back to the age of 10 and you say, oh, well, what might happen during my adolescence that could affect my prospects? I could get tall, or I could fail to get tall, depending on what goes on with my hormones. I could turn out to be beautiful or ugly, depending on, et cetera, right? You'd want to buy insurance against that. Well, then go back to the age of 5 and say, what could happen between, and you guys are getting the idea, right? Because then you can go back to your birth and you can say, well, given these genes that I have, if I could think rationally at this point, which I can't, which is the reason I can't buy insurance against it, but given these genes that I have, I want to buy insurance against what family I'm born into and how well they'll raise me, against what country I live in, right? All these sorts of things. But then you could even go back further. How about you don't even know what your genes are? You would want to buy insurance against getting good or bad genes, probably, right? And so we would think, just even from a pure libertarian perspective, imagine that there was something just impeding a market from being created, right? There was just no market for something for some reason that people felt uncomfortable with it, or we've been just talking about all sorts of ways the governments try to create markets for things, externalities, et cetera. There's no market for these really long-term insurance. So shouldn't someone create that market? Maybe shouldn't the government create that market, right? Wouldn't that make everyone better off? If everyone would choose to buy that insurance, which most people probably would, wouldn't it be better to just provide that insurance, right? And that is exactly what you can think that redistributive taxation does, right? It redistributes from the wealthy to the poor because people would have chosen that to buy themselves insurance against ending up being poor in exchange for a little bit of reduction of wealth when they were wealthy, right? Okay, so therefore, from that perspective, if people were evaluating things before they knew who they were, before they knew where they were in society, they would make choices so as to maximize their expected utility. And if they didn't know who they were, that's just, they would maximize the average utility of people in society, right? Now, Adam Smith gave a very similar perspective. He said that we should evaluate different social arrangements according to the judgment of an impartial outside observer, which is sort of like viewed from behind a veil of ignorance, right? So therefore, this argument suggests we should try to maximize the average utility in society. And this principle is called utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham described it as doing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And the typical way that we tend to do this is we view people's utilities being some function of their income plus a function of all the non-material benefits they get in their life, right? These are things like leisure or identity or enjoyment from your work that don't directly come from income. Yeah, Andy?
So by utilitarianism, you mean like greatest good for not only like the people that are currently present, but for future generations?
That's a
as well?
big issue. I don't even want to go there.
Okay.
We talked a little bit about that when we talked about externalities, right? And that makes this stuff all really complicated. But yes, that is a big issue. Depending on how you define this, it could be a great idea to kill off a lot of poor people, or to stop a lot of poor people from being born, at least. It might cause them to suffer to be killed. But if you could stop them from being born, that might be good. Okay. So, and by the way, I don't think that's as crazy as it sounds, but it's a difficult issue. Okay. So, for a utilitarian, social welfare is the sum of individual people's welfares, right? So the total social utility is just the integral over all the people in the population, if there is a continuum of people, of the utility that they earn from both of these sources, integrated with respect to the number of people of that income that there are. And all people are weighted equally. This captures the idea that we don't know who we are behind the veil of ignorance, right? From this perspective, inequality is really just another form of inefficiency. The rich don't have anything to do with their wealth. The poor have something to do with it. So moving money from the rich to the poor makes society work more efficiently. And in fact, everyone would have chosen that behind the veil of ignorance. Okay. Now, the reason that the rich don't value their money as much as the poor do is that we assume that the utility function of income is concave. Why do we assume that the utility function of income is concave? Well, let's review that. Okay. So the basic idea is that you run out of good uses for money, and once you have a certain amount of it, and you have to move on to less good uses, right? This is basically the reason why people buy insurance. And some people might say, well, maybe not everybody is risk averse. Maybe I'm risk neutral or something like that. You often hear that argument from some people. So let me give you an example to try to persuade you that actually you're much more risk averse than you think. So imagine that we flip a coin. And if it comes up tails, I'm going to give you $2. If it comes up heads, we'll flip the coin again. If it comes up tails, I'll give you $4. If it comes up heads, we'll flip it again. And $8, $16, $32, etc. You get the idea? So every time it's heads, we flip again. If it's tails, I pay you the amount that I stated. Okay. So saying, how much would you be willing to pay for this?
I see that the expected value would be very high.
So how much would you be willing to pay? If I offered to do this with you right now, how much would you pay me to do this with you? $5? Is anyone willing to pay more than 5? Raise your hand. Is anyone willing to pay more than 10? Keep your hand raised. More than 20? 30? 40? 50? Oh, some people are coming back in. 6? That's already irrational. How about anyone willing to pay more than $500? No. Okay. How much, Kevin, would a risk-neutral person be willing to pay to do this?
Well, you just cut it by the expected value and pay exactly that.
Why don't you tell me what that is?
So, you have a 50% chance of getting $2.
Yeah.
So that's $1. And then off of that, you have another 50%, so that's 25% of getting. Oh, okay. So it's like money.
You got it. So what is it?
I mean, it's
Yeah, it's 1 plus 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 1, et cetera, right? So a risk-neutral person would be willing to pay infinity to do this, right? So apparently you guys are not risk-neutral, right? And in fact, I think it's hard to imagine any sane person paying very much for this. And therefore, I think you can immediately conclude that pretty much everyone is quite risk-averse, right? Okay, so risk aversion alone gives us some motive for redistributing wealth, right? But to get more specific and to really derive conclusions, it depends on what particular utility function we use. And this will determine exactly how much redistribution, because the more concave utility is, the more you're going to be willing to pay for insurance. The less concave utility is, the less you're going to be willing to pay for insurance, right? Okay, so luckily, just like Zipf's law was this incredible, miraculous empirical regularity, right? There's quite a lot of good evidence about what people's utility function looks like. And in particular, most evidence we have suggests it's very close to being logarithmic. So this is a super, super intuitive way of thinking about people's utility. It says that doubling anyone's income makes them an equal amount more happy, right? If you currently have $1,000 and you have an income of $2,000, that makes you as much more happy as someone who has $10,000 moving to $20,000, or someone who has $1 million moving to $2 million. And mathematically, it's a very convenient form. And most importantly, it has a lot of empirical support. So one striking example of this was a paper that came out in 2011 by Dan Sachs and co-authors. And what they did is they studied people's what's called subjective well-being. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of this, but it's the idea that we can ask someone on a ladder of life from 1 being the worst life you can imagine yourself living to 10 being the best, where would you put yourself, right? And they go around, they ask all sorts of people these. Now, this sounds like really fishy data. It's like, how the heck does anyone answer that question? How do people, know even what the scale is? Couldn't people at different places have different interpretation? I mean, there's just so much that seems wrong with that approach. But amazingly, if we let H be the well-being that people report having, and I be their income, astonishingly, if you look across the world, you basically find that the following equation, H equals 0.35 log I plus some noise, fits incredibly, incredibly well, both within and across countries. So let me show you some data of that. So each one of these dots represents a country. And what we've plugged in here is the average income in that country and the average happiness score. So if we plot those, you notice a very clear thing. There's an increasing line. The higher your per capita GDP is, and they've put this on a logarithmic scale, it has a linear relationship, very clearly linear relationship with your happiness. Now, what they also did is that in each one of these countries, they ran a regression. And they drew a line corresponding to the regression line from that country. Notice that all the countries' lines are basically parallel to one another and parallel to the overall line. So that says that both within and across countries, the relationship between income and happiness is the same.